Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Magnacca, and today my co-host Rob Brandt sits down with Tracee Smith, President and CEO of Keewaywin Capital Incorporated, a private credit fund with a singular urgent focus, financing the construction of homes for Indigenous communities across Canada. Tracee is a Missinaibi Cree entrepreneur with over 2 decades of experience raising capital, building organizations, and navigating the complex financing landscape that governs unreserved lending. She is also the founder of Outside Looking In, a nationally recognized dance and youth leadership charity that has sent thousands of Indigenous young people through to high school graduation. In their conversation, you'll discover why Canada's major banks have largely failed to serve unreserved housing markets, and why that failure has created compelling private credit opportunity. You'll learn how Keewaywin's partnership with the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, commonly called CMHC, provides investors with near sovereign-backed security on social housing projects. And you'll understand why UK and European pension capitals already begin to look seriously at funds like this one. For institutional investors, the question is no longer whether Indigenous partnerships create value. It's whether you understand the specific mechanisms well enough to act on them. This conversation with Tracee is a strong place to start.
Tracee Smith, President and CEO of Keewaywin Capital. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Robin.
This one will do. My co-host, Mark Magnacca, is currently on leave, so it'll just be the two of us in conversation today. But let's get into it. And I want to ask you, Tracee, you're President and CEO of Keewaywin. We'll talk about Keewaywin shortly, but tell us a little bit about your own personal journey to get to where you are today.
Yeah, so my background, I'm from Missinaibi Cree First Nation, Treaty 9, near kind of between Wawa and Timmins area in Ontario. My mother's side is from there, and we've spent a lot of great time as kids in the territory, and I'm happy that we can bring our kids there now too. It's been a journey to obviously get to the beginning of Keewaywin. It seems like it's a long winding road, I guess, to get to where it is today. But I always spent over my career, I made it a personal choice that I wanted to contribute, my education, my background to, providing my knowledge and experience and contributions to our community. That was a very personal decision that I made early on in my life. And I held to that. And it's kind of how and why Keewaywin was brought to fruition over many years of thought and consultation with my own, people that I go to for advice. And but it was, I think because I made that personal decision to contribute and really kind of dedicate my purpose in my life to our community, I think that really helps me make decisions every day when I wake up every morning.
You've got a really interesting mix of arts and business background. I want to talk about the art side and in your dancing and some of the organizations you've worked with there and founded.
Yeah, so I since I was 4, I danced my whole life, and that was my passion and my love. Something that was, my obsession as a kid. And I was fortunate enough that my parents had the ability to put me in dance classes all the way through to getting a university degree in dance. That's how much I loved it. As soon as I found out I could go to university for dance, I think I found that out when I was in grade 7. Through, I don't know how I picked up some sort of a York University guide. I honestly don't know how I got it, but I found out that you could go to university and get a degree in dance. And my mom always told me I had to go to university. So we didn't have a choice. We had to go to university. I have 2 older brothers. And that was I was set. I knew what I wanted to do to that point. So, I was very entrepreneurial too, though, as a kid and as a young adult. I've officially, publicly people see I started outside looking in Keewaywin, but I've probably started 10 other companies before or around that, whether I was cleaning people's houses, delivering newspapers. I've had many jobs that I've created in my own life. Yeah. So very entrepreneurial. I come from an entrepreneurial family, and both my brothers are entrepreneurs too, grandparents. So I think it's maybe just in the blood. No one ever told me to just be an entrepreneur. It's just, I think it's been in the blood. But the arts to business kind of transition isn't as big of a jump, maybe to other people it is. But because I've always been entrepreneur and started my own and made my own money a lot of the times, going into business and understanding how business works wasn't a big jump for me to make. How it really did happen, what people see publicly, is that I went from an arts organization to business. But, once I had my dance degree, that's when I was teaching a lot of dance in various communities, reserves across the country. I was in the kind of the prime of my career and performing a lot and all that kind of stuff. So people would say, "Can you come teach our kids?" So I used to do that quite a bit. And then when I graduated with my dance degree, I knew I wanted to go into business because I knew my body could only handle so much. I already had a couple of knee surgeries under me. I knew I wasn't going to dance very much longer. So,
And sorry, what kind of dance are we talking about? A specific type?
Yeah, so I did everything. I did everything a dancer can do: ballet, tap, jazz, modern, contemporary, hip hop, everything. So, but when I went to different communities, I would only teach hip hop because hip hop was very accessible to kids. They don't need any special shoes. They don't have to wear tights and leotards. Just get into the gym and we'll turn on some loud music and we'll have a lot of fun. So when I went to reserves, hip hop and still is a very big thing, and kids love it, right? Dancing to the music that's in today. So that's kind of what I was doing when I transferred into my MBA. And when I did my MBA, I focused on Indigenous Ec Dev, but I was at the same time, I don't know why I did it, but at the same time I did launch Outside Looking In, but not knowing I was creating a company. So I just went to a reserve one year, and I got hired to go there for a week and work with kids. But it turned into a life-changing journey for me. I don't know why that community, but when I got there, I said to the kids, okay, we're going to dance every day and we're going to put on a big show on Friday and we're going to perform for the community. So that was our mission for the week. And when we did that, the community we advertised, this is a really small remote community. No one knew we were doing this except them. And the community all came out, and the routines we could do were very short because I only had a week with two sets of kids. But at the end of the performance, a lot of the community had tears in their eyes. The kids were very emotional. And that sense of accomplishment was quite strong. And in our communities, there's not a lot of platforms for parents to cheer their kids on and be proud of their kids. And kids want that same ability to show their parents what they can do. And that was kind of the impetus of, I'm like, geez, if people think this is really big deal, because I did it my whole life, like I could do this so much bigger. I've performed in big stages. I've, performed, all over. So I said, that's kind of like, well, let's just try this. Hey community, why don't we just go do this but I'm going to put some strings attached, and if you guys got to stay in school though, so this community had a high dropout rate. They didn't have really any high school graduates in that community when I was there. So the next year I said, let's just try it. And I came up with the name, and then, I was working at the bank by that time. I was actually working full time at, I think I don't know if I was at BMO or TD at that time. I can't. It was kind of a blur, but I was working full time and traveling to this community every 3 weeks to teach the kids, and we were tracking the kids' attendance, all that. And then by the time April came, I started with 30 kids, and by the time we finished, we had 5 in Toronto to perform in a big show. And I produced the show, paid for a theater, all that. But it was that's kind of how it was a company I created, but I didn't know I was creating a company but when people said, I want to write you a check, I'm like, well, I don't want the check. I gotta come up with a company name. So that's kind of how, and then it was a big success that first year. We had a big audience and other communities were saying, hey, we want you to do it here. So it's just an idea that steamrolled into something, that turned into it was a business. And then once we realized, well, we're accepting all this money, we're not trying to make money here. Then I turned it into a charity. So that's kind of how it was kind of just one thing after another. And then eventually I'm like, okay, this is an organization now. This is kind of serious.
It's amazing what to start out with, say, well, let's turn on some music and have some fun in the gym, and turn that into what an organization like Outside Looking In is today. But the stories, and clearly it's a lot more than just about having fun or learning some new dance moves.
That's
it's
right.
really having a community impact and a personal impact on the kids who are involved, in their families even. I'm not, fortunately not the dancer my wife wishes I was, but it all sounds very familiar to the sport and what sport can do for youth and communities and everything else. Maybe talk about what Outside Looking In is today.
Yeah, so I've been away from the organization for a couple of years, but over the 17 years I was involved. Eventually we turned it into a high school credit dance program that's accredited across the country. So because the kids are dancing, you need 110 hours of design curriculum to issue a credit to any kid in high school. So it's a grade 7 to 12 high school credit program. So even if kids are in grade 8, we can issue them a grade 9 credit, which is so amazing because that's really what inspires them to keep going. Like in Indigenous communities, there's such a high dropout rate after grade 8. A lot of kids don't go on after grade 8. So if we can get them enticed to say, hey, look, you got your grade 9 and you got a grade 10, they're more entitled to keep going. So it's a high school credit dance program. There's leadership programs that we created in partnership with, it was called RBC at the time. So I think RBC is still involved. I think Sun Life now is involved with introducing our kids to technology and careers. So there's a whole, when we were really good the first 5 years getting kids to graduate, we're getting them to graduation. And then we found even after that, they weren't going on to anything. So that's what the impetus of okay, well, now we need to start talking to them about what happens after high school. So then you get all these other organizations partnering with the charity, right? And it's just kind of evolved into, they still do the big show in Toronto every year. And it's just amazing. I still keep in touch with a lot of the kids who are now, I met them when they're 11. I still look at them like they're 11, but they're like 30. So, but it's nice to see their development and their careers, blossoming as a result of the program, right?
Yeah.
So,
I bet it is. And we digress a little bit because we're focused on Indigenous transactions, interesting business opportunities, and but we also love to hear the personal stories and the passion and the community impacts, and so maybe talk a little bit about how you go from working on Bay Street and some of the ideas, clearly entrepreneurial, trying a bunch of things, but it all culminates in Keewaywin Capital. So maybe tell us a bit about that story.
You know what? Before I started Outside Looking In, I was actually going to go into housing. I was focused on that. It's just that, my life I let my life kind of take me to where things were going, and it took me that way. But I was always very passionate about housing. And even more so, while I was running the charity, because of the situations and the communities that I've been to, stayed in many over the years. Everything starts at home, right? And there's so many kids and there's so many families that I've seen because I used to talk to kids a lot too, right? How come you're not at school today? Well, I didn't really have a good sleep last night because something was broken, or we were woken up by this, or, like there's, I had a kid too that used to say there's just mice running around constantly in our house and I just can't sleep. So I have many of those kinds of stories, which probably was the motivation. Everything starts at home. You have a healthy home, you might have a better chance at a healthier life. And I don't think the passion for Keewaywin can come from a more unique spot because of, the life that I've lived so far. Yes, it's a private credit fund. There's lots of financial terms. It's a very sophisticated thing. But when you get down to it, it's quite simple why we're doing this. And if people don't have, a lot of people who I deal with on the investor side have no experience in our communities. And to try and explain things like that to them, you really have to try to tell them why. And I think Canadians generally, I know some of our questions today are on the international side, but the Canadian public and the Canadian investor base has seen these stories, right, for many years on the housing crisis in our communities, well before the Canadian government has claimed there's a housing crisis for the average Canadian. Like, there's been a housing crisis in Indigenous communities for 50 years. And there still very much is. This is nothing new. I didn't start this because of a Canadian housing crisis. I started because this crisis has been going on for so long. So I always felt through when I raised capital, I've been raising money for 20 years because of the charity. That's, I got very good at doing that. I know how to, pitch a idea and sell it and actually use that money and do something good. Keewaywin's no different. The idea came when I saw enough people say to me, I want to give to your charity, but man, it would be really nice to not just put my money in a GIC at the bank. It would be nice to put my money towards something that I can see, and actually I could get my money back and get a return. I said, yeah, it would be great, wouldn't it? And that's kind of how these conversations happen with people that I know who have money, who want to do something with their money. That's just not plopping it somewhere and getting a return, like a passive investment, right? So that's really was kind of the impetus to actually start. I had this idea for Keewaywin back in 2014, pitched this exact fund idea to two banks, and it just went over their heads. They couldn't get their head around it. So I kind of sat on that for a few years because I had other things I was doing, including having a couple kids. So I just said, I'm going to wait until my kids are a bit older and then, maybe start this. And I was lucky enough that I had a seed investor who committed to me 10 years ago. He said, when you want to start it, we'll seed it. So I was very fortunate in that way to have seed money to actually start the company. But that's really why, it comes from a very logical place to me to do this. I think there's a lot of pent up demand for this kind of opportunity because we hear from a very unique investor base that wants to it has to be an investor though that actually wants to make the move from passive investing to impact investing. There's not a difference there except you get a return and you actually get to know where your money went and who it impacted, which I think is actually a better investment than just, a passive GIC, put it in a passive investor. Like if you really are interested in that kind of investment, then I think hopefully more of these kinds of opportunities come up, right?
So Keewaywin is focused on providing credit to build homes on reserve, off reserve, First Nations communities, Indigenous communities. What is the objective?
So the priority is to build, our main focus is on reserve in First Nations communities, in Inuit as well. We prioritize that first. Because off-reserve projects are a lot easier to finance for banks, and I call banks kind of lazy lenders. They like to just follow a formula and just do what kind of is in the manual, right? Banks aren't creative that way. So on-reserve lending is not very different than off-reserve lending, but banks seem to think it is. So because banks don't necessarily like to look at on-reserve, that's where we're playing, is mostly in that market, because we think it's very easy to lend on reserve, and we're getting a lot of traction that way. So that's kind of our priority right now. We did, in the early days when I started the company, I did reach out to CMHC asking, we're raising a bunch of private money and we want to bring it. Is there a way to partner with you? And that's kind of how we started partnering with CMHC, was through their social housing program. So the way our partnership works with them is they allocate annually to a social housing program. And because it's only an annual program, we say, well, if you're allocating this year, then we'll allocate the next 2 years our money to that same community. So instead of a community having to build and plan yearly, they can actually build 3 years of homes in that first year. And then CMHC comes and takes us out of our position once the homes are built. So we can lend directly to a First Nation, or we lend through the CMHC housing program as well.
And let's talk a little bit about why. I mean, the need is mind-boggling. The state of housing on reserves across Canada and in the far north is pretty shocking in a lot of cases. So there's huge demand there. Maybe talk a little bit about why traditional lending, or the traditional lenders, have not taken up that market, or find it a difficult market to lend into, and why you think Keewaywin, as you said, you're finding it's not much different than off-reserve lending, and more straightforward than people would think when they hear about Indian Act issues with security and mortgages. And tell us a little bit about that.
What I like to kind of say is there's usually a capacity mismatch between lenders and First Nations, right? There's not a lot of capacity at banks, and I'm talking human resources, that know who they're lending to. So you have people in the banks that are hired to lend, and I know this because I worked as a lender in a bank. They have no idea how First Nations work. They've probably never been to a community, and they have no idea how to read the financial statements in our communities. So all of that makes for, and when you're up against targets as a lender to lend out so much money, you're going to go with the easiest hanging fruit, lowest hanging fruit close to you, right? So, and banks look back at their policies. Their policies are old, right? They're looking at policies developed in the 60s and 70s still. Like no one has updated these policies. So when you go back as a lender and you're looking at, oh, geez, there's a thing called the Indian Act, and oh my gosh, we can't repatriate an asset off reserve. Holy geez, this is just so risky. And banks like to lend on against land, right? They can understand grabbing that, being able to grab the land after. And once they figure, oh, geez, we can't grab that land, well, oh my gosh, we just can't do it. I'm not saying all banks are like that. I think some banks are getting better, but I would say it's in pockets, because there's still a nightmare story I heard when I was out in Saskatoon, that, one of the big 5 banks, there's a gentleman that wanted to get a house on a reserve, and the band said, okay, sure, we'll guarantee it for you. So the guy went to the bank, said, my band's going to guarantee my loan. And they said, okay, sure, we'll lend to you. So they made the guy get a modular home and put it on almost like wooden stilts, so that they could go and grab that house back from him should they require it. And this is only 5 years ago. So that's what I'm talking about. There are pockets of good lenders. I find, BC is a little bit of a different beast. People love to look at BC as a great place but it's easier out there, right? It's a little bit different than other places. Leased land is a thing now, where people like to just lease your land, and then, but the only reason why you're doing that is so that the bank can get comfort. It's not because it's giving a lot of benefits to the communities. It's that the banks are getting comfort that way if they're lending on leased land, right? So there's a huge, and I don't see the banks really doing it. And I've watched and I've worked with them over the years in terms of changing their mentality towards this. I think it's inexcusable that the banks love taking money on deposit from our communities, but they don't go ahead and return that back in the form of loans, right? There wouldn't be a housing crisis if the banks actually came up with a strategy on, and it's not hard. You just need some smart people sitting around a table for, a year or two to put the strategy together to figure out how can we deploy more capital to Indigenous communities to build homes. It's really not hard, but there's no will, and it has to come from the top, and the top isn't talking about it. So until that happens, unfortunately, companies like mine have to exist to get more private money directed at these opportunities.
And you closed a small first fund, was it 2 years ago, 10 million? And now have signed another commitment with a group called Van City. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we're about to do a final close April 1st. That's our goal, is to do a final close. We think we'll probably do a final close close to 15 to 20 million for this first fund. We did we just announced our partnership with Van City Investment Bank, where any deal that we do that maybe CMHC isn't going to do as a takeout, and it's a larger projects, or then Van City will be our takeout partner, because we're not a long-term lender. We're there to literally either have First Nations, if they wanted to purchase homes or they want to build and construct, construct their own. Once it gets to final completion, then that's where we offload the loan to Van City in that regard. So we're there for that. The hardest financing to get for communities is the design to final completion, that construction dollars. Usually they're having to wait to hear back from ISK or CMHC on if they get the money, and some communities will wait decades for money from, and they get a little bit of money every year, but it's not enough to even construct sometimes one or two homes. So we're there to give that money to at least get it done, get people in the homes, and then it goes to a long-term lender like a Van City. So,
and what kind of risk are you taking as Keewaywin taking in situations like that? And is there a secret sauce for security and structures that you can talk about?
Yeah, every community is going to be different, right? Every community we look at where we can get security, and there's 100% always, all the time, there's a place to get security. You just have to work through the process to see where you can get that comfort. Some communities it's really easy, and some communities it's a little bit more difficult, depending on cash flows or other revenues that they have or other assets that you can use to lend against. But in terms of, the only other risk I would say there is just basic construction project risk, right? We want to get the project started and we want to get it built, because that's what our investors want to see. They want to know that their money went to actually constructing a completed home and people are living in that home. So that's the most important part for us is that project risk and managing that, all the way to the completion.
Right. And all relatively new, but do you have shovels in the ground or completed homes that you can point to today?
With just our final close, we're actually about to get ready to start a couple projects. One's in Manitoba, and it's a $25 million deal, 30 homes with 200 unit infrastructure being constructed. So we're building out the infrastructure for 200 homes, but then 30 of the modular units will go in as well. But what's so good is that the infrastructure is going to be there so that as they get more money or as they want to, they just put more homes into their community, right? This community has a lot of homes that are deemed unlivable. So there'll be a nice transfer from those homes into these brand new homes. And it's only going to be probably life-changing for a lot of the community members, right? In that way, to have 200 new homes over, say, the next 5 years is going to be unbelievable. It's almost like a brand new community, right? So, and then we have lots of Section 95 projects that we're looking at in the next month with CMHC. So communities, especially from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, we're looking at prioritizing for this round. So no shortage of housing projects.
What's the Section 95 project?
So Section 95 project is what I was saying before in terms of the CMHC, that's their social housing program. It's been around for 50 years. It was developed way back when, I think it was under the Chrétien government. Actually, they developed that program with the advice of a lot of the chiefs and leaders at the time. It's a successful program in the sense that they haven't had any defaults. The hard part about the program is that they have a restrictive budget. So it's only $150 million, and it's supposed to be for the benefit of all of our communities across the country. So when you do the math on 150 million, 630 communities, you get 0.6 houses built. So I know CMHC advocates the federal government to increase the Section 95 budget. Honestly, I don't know when it was last increased. It might have been about 15 years ago, but it's just not enough. And so what CMHC does is they look at the less riskiest communities to lend to. So communities that, are financially healthy, they build projects, they complete them. So it's a very risk-averse program. And we're there just to allow communities to build more faster, advance it versus having to wait next year to reapply again. We'll advance our funds in advance so they can build 3 years of homes in 1 year. So,
Wow, it sounds like there's endless demand for what you're setting out to do. And I noticed that another, I don't know how similar they are, but Raven's Outcome Fund just recently closed and raised some money doing similar sorts of things. Is there an opportunity have you had interest from investors outside of Canada in what you're doing at Keewaywin?
Yeah, a couple of the banks have come to me and said that they have investors and pension plans, especially in London. One of the banks I'm talking to has a large pension. That's all he deals with is pensions. And I think he lives and works in the UK. So he says there's a lot more interest and discussions around coming into funds like these. I don't think it's widespread yet. It seems very early days that people are discussing and dabbling in it. It'd be nice to see, more money coming in and being put to work faster. I don't know, but I haven't had, although I haven't really reached out to investors beyond Canada.
Well, you should think about coming to London for our next summit in April if you're not already booked. But there is quite a developed ESG social impact investment community over there, and I don't think they think about Canada necessarily as a destination for those types of projects. And so we believe there's a lot of capital, and part of the purpose of that summit will be our third annual summit. Part of the purpose of that is to get some of the stories like yours out to the investment community there and make them aware of what is happening in Canada and how things have changed and some of the exciting investment opportunities.
Yeah, no, I agree. I did talk to somebody in Scotland, somebody who runs family offices, and it kind of seemed like like when you say, I think a lot of people don't think of Canada. I think because probably internationally people think Canada is just fine. We're a first world country. They have no idea in the Indigenous space and how there is, a 2-tiered, 3-tiered system in this country, and how there's so much discriminatory lending practices that still happen here. it's baked into our laws. Like a lot of people just don't know that and don't know how it impacts people on the ground. So the more that people can hear about those kinds of things is important. And it is. I'm sure people internationally think, well, how can that happen in a country like that where it shouldn't? Yeah, I don't know how to answer that, but it is unfortunate that way. So,
Well, it's stories like yours that the more we get them out through channels like this and others, we can change that perception and attract more interest. Because Canada alone probably doesn't have enough capital to do all the things that need doing.
that's right.
Tracee, you've mentioned CMHC a few times for the benefit of our listeners, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, but what is that entity that you're dealing with fairly regularly?
Yeah, so CMHC is, like you said, a crown corporation. So they're funded by the government, by the Canadian federal government, for housing, mainly housing, and not so much infrastructure per se. But they have a small mandate to for housing for Indigenous people. Most of the housing mandate for Canada is under Indigenous Services Canada. So CMHC does have a small mandate within them, like I said, a small budget to provide housing dollars for Indigenous people. And like we talked about before, it's, the dollars and the money are just not enough from a government budget perspective to satisfy the huge need there. But what's important for the partnership with Keewaywin and why our investors came to the table and what attracted the investment opportunity, what people liked is that when we go into a deal like a Section 95 deal and build social housing in partnership with CMHC, we put our investors' money to work in building those homes. And then when the homes are built and reach final inspection, CMHC is the one that directly pays us back our money. So it's not the First Nations so much that is paying us back, but it's CMHC saying thank you for essentially advancing our funds to us to build more homes faster. So having that CMHC, although they can't legally say it's a guarantee, they're not allowed to say that, and we can't do that. I would say it's almost one step away from a guarantee because CMHC and us are managing and overseeing the project together from the beginning to the end. And that's what attracted a lot of investors to it, is that in a way, the Canadian government is involved with this. There is a will on the Canadian government to build more homes for Indigenous people. So most of our investors that come in, and we have about an investor base of about 15 different investors, that's what they like to see. So, and that makes our investors open to other projects that don't have CMHC involved as well, right? So, so hopefully that clarifies that.
Yeah. And then maybe lastly, longer term picture for Keewaywin. What is a part of the grand plan? Do you see application for what you're doing to other areas, infrastructure in particular needs?
Yeah, on the infrastructure part, I know that we wanted to touch on the infrastructure piece. I think it's important to know, because I think a lot of people don't know how infrastructure is done in Canada. And I'm talking more on housing infrastructure, but it could be applicable to other infrastructure projects like electricity, telecom, things like that. But for infrastructure for housing, a lot of First Nations have to apply to and put what they want to build into a 5-year plan with First Nations, with ISK. And when their turn comes up, they can get the funds, should the funds be available. The government never guarantees that the funds will be there. But there's always this 5-year rotating infrastructure cycle that if you need a new school, put it on the list, and when it comes up, we can do it. Same for housing. So a lot of the times, like I said, we're not just doing housing, we're doing infrastructure, because you can't do housing without infrastructure. And people understand that Indigenous people have to go to They have a housing, they have to go somewhere for housing money. They have to go somewhere else for infrastructure money. So for example, for a Section 95 project, they can only get housing money from CMHC. They can't get infrastructure money. So they're going to have to contact ISK for infrastructure. Then they have to go and contact CMHC for housing. And a lot of times those two don't marry. The timing doesn't line up. So we're having a lot of discussions around, can Keewaywin do housing and infrastructure? And the answer is yes, because we would want to do that. Sometimes we're working on projects where the First Nations got the infrastructure and it's built. There's one community I'm working with, Manitoba, that they have 28 lots built, and they've been built for a year and a half, but they can't get the housing money from a bank or CMHC or anyone. So they've come to us to say, can you give us money for these 28 units so we can put houses on another band in Saskatchewan said, we have finally gotten the infrastructure money for 60 units. It took us 12 years for ISK to finally give us the infrastructure money to build these units. But then the next problem is their same thing. We don't have money for housing. So there's all these, that's what I mean about systemic issues with how the government runs these programs. It's not like what maybe Carney's trying to do with Build Canada Homes and in one place. And I honestly don't even know how that's working yet, but it's just not a nice process, which is why, if you don't maintain your home, after 10, 20 years, it's not going to look too good. So you go into a lot of our communities and it's hard to maintain homes that aren't built properly in the first place. And you don't have enough money to maintain them. Like it's a problem. It's a huge problem, right? In so many ways. So infrastructure financing generally is a huge problem in Canada because we just, like you said, we don't really have that much money in the budget to do a lot of these large projects. You got to go sometimes elsewhere to get international money to build up here, right? So, yeah.
Right. In ISK is Indigenous Services Canada, the government ministry responsible for delivering services to Indigenous people in Canada. Well, Tracee Smith, it's been great talking to you. Named one of Canada's top 50 artists by the Canadian Council for the Arts, president and CEO of Keewaywin Capital, a new private credit fund dedicated to building homes for Indigenous people in Canada. Really a pleasure talking to you. Really interesting story. Good luck with everything you're doing. Thank you for everything you have done and are doing for our communities, and for your time.
Thanks so much, Rob. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you to Tracee Smith for sharing her insights with us, and thank you for viewing and listening. Mark your calendars for the upcoming 2026 Summit, taking place on the 8th of April. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.